quick note before we begin. There's a character in this review who I misgender, but to do otherwise would be a pretty major spoiler, and so I have chosen to refer to them as the gender they are first introduced as.
Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. So I'm gonna start this video by saying two things. First, I'm gonna mispronounce any name or title I try to say in this video. Not because they're inherently hard, but just because I am unfamiliar with them, and so my tongue just tends to forget how to say them in the middle of the damn word. I apologize profusely for that. And second, I am so damn excited to have had an excuse to read this book. Because I was not supposed to be buying new books right now, except for the list of possible comps for my manuscript. And luckily, someone suggested this one. So this book is about Amina al-Sirafi, a female smuggler in sort of a pseudo-fantasy version of medieval Indian Ocean area. Or she was a smuggler. She retired about 10 years ago after a disastrous adventure which left a member of her crew, a friend, a man named Asif, dead. And her pregnant with a child that she must keep secret from her husband. A husband who is not actually human. And now she's just trying to live a peaceful, if impoverished, life. Then the mother of her long-dead friend appears at her door, demanding help. It seems Asif had a daughter, and the child, now 16, has disappeared. Her grandmother believes the kid was kidnapped by a Frank, and promises Amina a fortune if she can bring the girl home. Though Amina does not want to leave her own daughter, the combination of guilt at what happened to Asif, the promised fortune, and a threat against her own family drags Amina out of retirement and back out onto the wildly dangerous, beautifully full of promise, wildly magical, and murderous sea. So one of my favorite cartoons as a child was that awful Pirates of Dark Waters cartoon. Do y'all remember this one? It was clearly inspired by the stories of Sinbad, but in a loose way. Like, the main character was a blonde kid named Ren, who wore what looked like a jumpsuit with, like, pointy shoulders for some reason. And everything was just weirdly pink, and the villain was, like, this outrageously large man with a eye patch on one eye, and a bird, and a ship that swallowed other ships. I swear this thing existed and it was not just a fever dream. Like, I've even looked it up. It did, in fact, exist. But this stupid little cartoon had a huge impact on my psyche. Like, it invaded my mind. And because of that, if you combine a roughly pre-industrial fantasy world that is vaguely inspired by the Middle East and ships, you just have my interest piqued immediately. And I loved the notion of a more accurate to the real world history version of something like that. Add in a strong female lead, and I'm ready to go. You've got me. Admittedly, having a large portion of the narrative revolve around motherhood is not a draw for me, but the way it's handled in this book and used in this book, I don't find it off-putting. And I do appreciate a fantasy hero who also happens to be a middle-aged woman. But yeah, so I was already ecstatic with the mere idea of this book, and in my opinion, it lived up to its concept. The writing is solid, easy, smooth. It's mostly in Amina's voice, and her voice is one I can definitely relate to. She's world-weary and distrustful and aware of societal's ills, but she's also intensely hopeful and a form of ambitious that I can actually relate to. So many times when you see an ambitious hero, the ambition is something that just doesn't resonate with me. Like, no, I don't relate to caring desperately if people 100 years from now know my name. Objectively, I don't really care if people now know my name. I don't relate to desperately wishing for extreme fame, wealth, or political power. I, would like to have enough of a platform to feel that, the things I say could make a difference in the world, as proven by the fact that I have a YouTube channel where I'm trying desperately to get enough attention to get published. Obviously I want my voice to matter, but I have never had the desire to be a household name. And Amina's ambition felt real to me because of that. Her ambition feels familiar to mine because, yeah, what she's ambitious for is not like just, you know, the notion of wealth and power. It's the ability to affect change and to stand as a good example for future generations. But also there's just a harshness to her tone that felt an awful lot like the way I talk and the way the people around me talk. And that also, by the way, makes it a good comp for me. But not all of it is in her voice. There's a framing device at the beginning and the end. It's set up as a scholar is recording her words, and we do hear the scholar speak some, including randomly throughout the middle of the book as well. And that framing device did a wonderful job of setting us very solidly in a time and place. And it is such a wonderful, rich time and place. This is a world that is not very familiar to me. Like, honestly, other than the bad Sinbad cartoons, I have almost no knowledge of what real life looked like on the medieval Indian Ocean. I think like most Americans, if you say Middle East to me, my brain immediately snaps to deserts and the modern Muslim countries, and America's incredibly complex history with them. But I do also have some random ass, like, trivia kind of knowledge about Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley civilizations, but that's significantly older than this. This book basically takes place in the perfect dead zone in my historical knowledge. Like, everything I know about this time and place comes from Crash Course World History, which, it's good, but as stated by the name, it's not super in-depth. And I know conceptually things like the Arabic world was one where people were tending to be better traveled than Europe at the time. They were often better educated, and the Arabic world was about 100 years, at least 100 years ahead of Europe in math. But like most Americans, my education around that time period is almost exclusively about Europe. And it is lovely and fascinating to get a glimpse of a world that is so familiar and interconnected to the history I know, while also being so new and different to me. This is one of the things I love about fantasy, because even though this is not real history, like, there were not actually, you know, sea giant monsters eating people in the Indian Ocean in that time period, but it gives us a way of accessing that history or imagining that history without being too tied down to, like, dull historical information. And I love the boom in fantasy novels that are taking place in non-medieval Europe kind of settings, because we're getting to explore all these new worlds that give us just a glimpse into real history. And this book shows lovely world building. We spend time getting to see all the different places and people, and I love the fact that the author went out of her way to show that the sea was a place that many cultures came together. I think that's one of the reasons that, objectively, I always loved sea and sailing related books. Though personally, like, I get seasick. I'm never going to be a sailor. I could not handle probably even going on a cruise without puking up my guts every single day. But I really loved any book as a kid that, and as adult, that touched on the sea in any kind of way. And I think the reason is because all of these books featured characters that were just such wildly different people from wildly different cultures with wildly different religions and wildly different lives, all mingling together. So that even the ones that took place in real history felt like fantasy. And this book does follow that tradition. Our leads come from different points on the Indian Ocean. They practice different faiths, they wear different clothes, they look and act differently. Though I do wish we spent a little bit more time getting to know the broader crew so we could see their diversity. But what we do get is we get to meet dozens of minor characters when we visit the different ports. And I will say, yes, this is a book that honestly takes place more on the land than on the sea, which is good for me, considering it as a comp, because While my book does include the sea, it's not about sailing. I realized I made the mistake by telling people that ships were a major part of what I was looking for in comps, because everyone kept recommending pirate books to me, and I'm like, no, my book just happens to take place on a series of islands, so the traveling is all done by ship. And so this actually is helpful, that the majority of the really active things happening are on the land, not on the sea. But a lot of the conflict, the big action moments, take place on shore. There is one that happens on sea, but most is on shore. And yeah, sailing is significantly more intrinsic to this story than it is to my book, but most of the sailing is sort of passed over. We're given enough to know what's going on and how long it's taking and stuff like that, but we're not really delving in depth to it. And honestly, that's better for me as a reader, because I don't know much about boats. So unless you're planning on, like, giving me a Moby Dick level exposition tangent, I'm not really going to get what's happening if you're really going in depth about sailing details. Also, I may be wrong here, but I feel like this boat is a bit small for there to be major action scenes happening on it. It felt like it was a relatively small ship. And on that note, I do love the fact that the ships in this book are not the galleons and frigates that I'm used to reading about, and we're given just enough description that I have a vague idea of what it looks like, without getting so in-depth that you lose me in details that I will never understand because I don't know sailing jargon. I also really love how much this book is about faith, redemption, and religious convictions. This book actually starts, like, the opening paragraph is a Muslim prayer, which did a really great job of solidifying exactly where we are and what kind of world we're in. But it also, I will admit, an evil little part of me, I was very happy reading that and imagining some conservative Bible Belt, like, Christian picking this up in a library and opening the book up and reading a Muslim prayer and just freaking out because, oh my god. I will say the religion in this book does a lot more than just act as, like, a setting device. It's more than just the trappings of the time and place. It does a lot of different things. One that I found very interesting, of course, personally, is a lot of what it feels like it's doing is reminding us how similar Christianity and Islam actually are. But it also does a lot just talking about the ultimate human concepts of redemption and guilt. Amina talks and thinks a lot about how she is a sinner and how she relies on God's unending mercy. And the author was basically using these religious themes to talk about personal feelings of guilt and forgiveness and how they weigh on us and lift us up conversely. And I will admit that, once again, that's something that's very interesting to me to read about through the lens of a Muslim character, because it's very much the neighbor of something I'm very familiar with, but in itself, it is different and new. Yeah, I am a Christian. I grew up in a Christian area, and I myself am Episcopalian. But I honestly tend to really shy away from books that directly include religious Christian characters and themes. Characters that practice a faith that is a clear allegory for Christianity, yeah, I'm all about it. I find it really fascinating. I'd love to read it. I love seeing how different authors explore these concepts in fantasy, especially. Like Kate Elliott's Crown of Stars series. I didn't really like much of the series, but one of the things I did love was that there's a major religion in that one that feels like an allegory for Christianity, but a fantasy version. Another one, weirdly, the Kushel's Dart series, the religion in that one, it's like a kinky addendum to what feels like Christianity. I really liked that. Even the book that I just finished reading, Priory of the Orange Tree, Virtuedom is clearly an allegory for Christianity amongst many other things. But when it's actual direct Christianity, like actual talk about Jesus, I get nervous. And I think a lot of that is because what I see a lot of people presenting as Christianity and Christians in media and books and TV just feels very alien to me. Like, the devout whispering, oh, I must obey God. It's so foreign to the way I see my faith. And, like, it's not necessarily wrong. Like, objectively, a lot of the Christians in the real world that I meet feel very alien to how I see my faith and my religion. Like, to the point of, quite often, when somebody introduces themselves to me as, "Hi, I'm a Christian," I get a bit nervous. And I think a large portion of that comes from the fact that fundamentalism in America has dominated the conversation about Christianity. So you get this one idea of what a Christian can look like. And it's not always a flattering idea. And I think that's why I get really nervous when I see Christians in books, because either it's going to be a text that is directly there to try to convert the sinner and teach us how good God can be, which I'm like, calm down. But the other side of that is they are the, villain Christian who is going to start spouting homophobic or, like, misogynistic things any second now. And so because of that, I see Christianity in a book and I just tense up. It does not spark joy with me. And I will admit, I did occasionally have that exact same reaction to seeing the Muslim faith in this book. And especially considering a lot of the strongest religious moments in this book, when Amina is most thinking about the way she interacts with her religion, is put in language that feels very familiar to someone having grown up in the Bible Belt. And so I got nervous. But I almost always immediately relaxed again, because how she actually thinks about her faith and how she interacts with it feels familiar to my faith. It's very much about, everyone having sins and just needing forgiveness, and how God can be that person to just give you forgiveness and give you permission to have messed up and continue to be better. The religion in this book, it's not even so much about God. It's about moving past your sins. And this book never felt like it was trying to convert me. It never told me that I was doing religion wrong. And it never told me I was going to burn in hell. It just explores what faith and God means for this character. And I really liked that. One thing I do want to address here, there's an author note in the beginning of the story, and for once I actually read it, I don't know why, but it mentioned that there was going to be a glossary in the back. And as soon as I started reading, I was really glad of that, because this is set in a magic version of a history I know very little about. And so I knew there were going to be some words that I didn't know. And yeah, there were. The author clearly did not shy away from using terminology that is more accurate to the culture we are in, which I like. Amina is not a captain. She's a Nakuda? Anglicizing everything would have stripped away a lot of the feelings of the world, but it also would have stripped away the depth. I can tell from the way the word is used that Nakuda does not just equal captain, and using the word captain instead would have erased all of that nuance. But my one problem is the glossary is too damn small. It had like 6 words to find, and most of them were words that were used often enough that I could have sussed out what they meant from context clues pretty quickly. But there were dozens of terms that were dropped in the book in passing that were not defined. And now some of them, I could still use context clues to figure out enough of what was going on. And failing that, there's Google. But I just wished some of them were in that glossary, especially when it comes to all the supernatural beings that appear in the book. I just wanted to know more about them. And I understand not wanting to include the definition of something like the Marin, because it's clearly meant to be a bit of a mystery until it appears. But I wanted to know more about pretty much every other creature that showed up. I'm curious, and in a way that's really great, because that means that I'm more likely to go look up the actual real-world mythology of all the cultures along the Indian Ocean. But including them in the glossary would have given me just a place to jump off from, something to start with. I also really loved how the themes of parenthood were used in this book, because this is not one of those books where a woman's entire identity is subsumed by the needs and trappings of motherhood. Amina, she loves motherhood. She loves her daughter, and she wants desperately to get back to her daughter. But that's not all she is. She still loves adventure, loves the sea, is still a sexual being, and is still a fighter. And she's not just this mother bear who focuses intensely, every iota of her being focused on protecting her daughter. She's also fiercely protective of her friends, her crew, and anyone who needs her protection. And very importantly to me, she also fights for herself. It's directly acknowledged sometimes she is protecting herself. And I really like seeing that because so often mother characters are presented as this paragon of self-sacrifice, that everything they do is to protect another. And it's nice to see a mother that just needs to protect herself first. Fashion your own seatbelt before you fasten the seatbelt of the child sitting next to you. So in the end, motherhood is a part of her, but it's not the only part. And that's a major part of her character arc throughout the entire story. I also love the way the LGBT characters are worked into the story. It feels very honest and accepting and in a loving, gentle kind of way. Because, yeah, that's another thing that I've always loved about stories taking place on the sea and on ships. There is often something that's just not heteronormative about them. Whether that be Ishmael marrying Queequeg while insisting all the while, not gay though, or Charlotte Doyle dressing in trousers to act as a cabin boy, or the actual history of real sailors entering into what is objectively marriages with their fellow crew members. There's a line in this book where Amina says to Dunya, "A life at sea often attracts those who don't fit in." And honestly, it seems to have been true. Like, that is a real part of history. Maybe that's part of what makes the sea such a melting pot of cultures. If you already don't fit in your culture, does it really matter if you're rowing next to someone who comes from a completely different land with a completely different, life? No. And of course that drew in LGBTQIA people. It also drew women who refused to define themselves by the roles society would grant them. There were real historical female pirates. The sea was welcoming to people who threw off what society expected them. And this book fully inhabits that. And that's what I love in a good sea story. A good pirate story, and also just what I love in a good story. Overall, I would 100% recommend this book to you. Unless you are one of those people who really just cannot handle any books that feature religious themes at all. Then avoid it. But everybody else, no, read this book. It's really good.